Hey everybody, I have a question for you. Do you think that you got a good sex education in high school or in college? If you're like most Americans, the answer is no, or I don't think I got one at all. You're not alone. I also went to a small Christian school where we did not really receive an education. It was a lot of scare tactics, a lot of you're gonna get pregnant, you're gonna get a disease, and those things are totally fair and on the table, but it only tells part of the story. Because the reality is that each of us gets to make our own decisions about what we consider safe and what is important going into a relationship. So I wanted to go through today a resource that I think is super helpful. I've referred it a bunch of times, and it's this. This is a whole workbook from Dr. Evelin Dacker, who's a friend of mine, and it's called STARS. STARS is an acronym, and what it stands for is your STI status, your turn-ons, avoids, relationship intentions, and STI etiquette. Now, it's a 31-page document, and you can fill it out online. I actually really recommend that you go to maketimeforthetalk.com while you're watching this video, maybe, and we could fill this out together. So I just wanted to go through this because it's been like an anchor letting me know, am I doing things that are safe, sane, and consensual? And am I actually like within my own ethics when it comes to playing? Because if you've watched any of my content before, you know that I very much like casual play. And this is how I keep my own anxieties down and how I know that I'm operating in a way that is ethical. Because I think a lot of us just kind of go with the flow on these things. So let's start with the first S in STARS, which is around STIs, which I think is the thing that scares most of us. Always a hard place to start. So let's go to this workbook. The first one is about when your last STI date was. I think a lot of us are maybe confused about how often we should be tested because the CDC literally doesn't have guidelines if you have more than 3 sexual partners. Like that's considered a lot. And for those of us who are not monogamous, did not say become attached to the first person or the second person or third person that you're with, that doesn't really work. So what is the actual guidance? And I think that a doctor would be the best person to get a guidance from. For me, it is every 3 to 4 months. And I get tested for the standard things. When I say I get tested for the standard things, what I mean is this list is more comprehensive than a standard STI test. For example, HPV, which you can only be tested for if you have a cervix because it's part of your pap smear. It is not part of that blood sample or urine sample. And for those who actually live with STIs, like if you're positive for genital herpes, like me, then it can make a safer sex talk very alienating, very othering when the other person freaks out because they have no clue. They're just carrying shame about this. She's included some things on here like hepatitis, which you may have been immunized for and not know. You might have to look into your own history. I see that she's also included HIV because there are folks who also live with HIV because there are medications on the market that have made it much more manageable. It is not a death sentence. And there's also medications for when you know you may be having riskier sex called PrEP. PrEP and PEP, that's what they're called. So if it's something you're concerned about, it's worth talking to your doctor. It's also worth knowing that certain types of sex carry different risk levels. So if you're wanting to protect yourself from everything and you're having low risk sex, you might be introducing a lot more medications into your body that are necessary, but you need to do what makes you feel safe and what makes sense to you. So do your research, figure out what makes sense, because there's also medications for herpes. For example, Valtrex comes to mind. And then there's lots of other woo-woo, I know this doctor, he cured all my ills that are out there. If you look at my episode with Courtney Brame, where we talk about disclosures and living with herpes, there's a lot of messages from people talking about some miracle cure. And I don't personally believe those exist. I think that is snake oil. You might have a different experience. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. She's also included under sexual health the ideas around orgasm and medication. Because the reality is if you're on different medications, especially if you're on ones that are for depressions or anxieties, it may change your sex drive. It may also change your ability to have an orgasm or how difficult it is to get there. Now, not all of us need to have an orgasm to have a great sexual experience, but maybe you feel differently. So being upfront with that, I think, is really good. She's also included on here erectile dysfunction, which is extremely common. If you need like lubrication, it's good knowing going in what you may need. And I personally don't even think of them as issues anymore. I don't have as much lubrication as I did 5 or 10 years ago. I see that just as my body maturing with time and maybe needing more attention and foreplay. So for me, filling out this STI portion, I would say that my last test was a couple months ago. I was negative for all of the typical things. I do know I test positive for HSV too. I also did have a pap smear about 6 months ago. It was negative, but I've had sex since then, including unbarriered sex with other partners. It may also be worth it to add to this list, you'll see it in the workbook as well, that you can have chlamydia and gonorrhea in your throat or in your anus, and you actually have to ask your doctor specifically to get tested in those areas if you need. I've personally not been tested there, and maybe next time. It's important to think through what disclosures are important to you and which ones are not, and also what questions to ask because you don't know what disclosures are important to the other person. All right, that's it for STIs. Let's talk about turn-ons. This is something where I think that the work of Sex Positive World really comes in because I think a lot of us don't really know what we're trying to get into. I talked about this a bit in my last video on dating because people will want to hang out or, go on a date or just want to sext, and you don't really know what you're getting into. If you're ever on the Dating Over 30 subreddit, there's a lot of interesting questions in there. I personally like to keep things in a more playful place. I'm not a big fan of big official dates, and there are some people who love big official dates. She's got a lot of examples in her workbook from conversation, romance, hand-holding, like physical touch that you might be into or the type of communication that you prefer. There's also on here the love languages. These are ways that we express our love to one another, and we actually tend to rank these subconsciously about which ones are priorities, which ones we maybe don't care about, and which ones are nice, but I don't really need them. So thinking through what you like to give and what you like to receive. I know that I'm a person who really loves words of affirmation, and I really like to give and receive quality time. So maybe those are different for you because you're not me. You'll also see on here something from the School of Consent, the work of Betty Martin, who does amazing workshops. And if you are unsure on these things, you have a bunch of free trainings on her website as well. The idea here is that consent can be broken into quadrants of serving, accepting, taking, and allowing. Which is to say, like, if you're somebody who enjoys being taken from, you may not want verbal consent all along the way. You may want to set out in advance just some boundaries when it comes to play and let the other person do more taking where you're doing more allowing. This allows us to establish what kind of communication we prefer in the moment, because for some folks, they really need verbal consent for every touch and every acceleration and everything that happens in the bedroom or even on a date. And there are those who would find that a complete turnoff and want somebody to read their body and their cues, and you want to know which one you are. She has also included here things around touch. I'm a person who really hates scratchy touch. I love that she's included this. And your relationship with the orgasm, because sometimes getting to an orgasm is really difficult. Like, let's be realistic. It can feel really awful when you have a difficulty getting to orgasm and the person you're with is very focused on it because it gets to be about that place we're trying to get and not enjoying the pleasure in the moment or the journey to get there. In this last section of turn-ons, I see that there's places for exploration or maybe some sharing of fantasies, which can be really scary, but remember, this is for you, so you don't have to share these with every partner. It's important to know what your own triggers are and what kinds of things you'd like to explore, though, because then you can actually invite in the types of people who can make those things happen, or you'd feel safe enough trying it with them. Whether or not you get there, that's a whole other thing. But if you know what you want, you're far more likely to actually get it. So now that we know what our turn-ons are, what about the things that we don't want? That's when we get to the avoid section. Now, there's a lot of examples in here of things that you may not be cool with. It's important to know what they are These are great examples. And then adding more at the end. This doesn't have to be a laundry list of things that you're not into. And maybe for you, your avoids list is very long. There is nothing wrong with that. You are not broken. There's nothing wrong with that. It's good to know what your boundaries are. It can also be really difficult to set your boundaries in the moment. You know, if somebody is starting to go for a thing that you are not cool with, you might find yourself unable to actually express that boundary. So if you know in advance that that's your hard line, then it is much easier to actually express that either in advance because you know and you've been there and you know you don't want that to ever happen, or in the moment to be like, I know that's a no. And I got to speak up, or I got to shift or do something to get away from this thing happening so that I can actually protect myself and have a good experience. In your avoid section can also be kind of a range of what your boundaries may be, because maybe you're open to trying something, but only with an intimate partner, or only if you have preparation, or maybe it's something within kink where you've seen it and you only want to do it in a practice space. Like knowing what would be the conditions that would make it okay for you to try something that you typically would be a no to, but you're interested in trying, because it's fun to push on our edges and try new things. I'm going to pause here and say too, if you are talking to somebody and you start talking about your avoids and you're getting lots of why, well, I like that, or I guess I just won't do that with you, I would recommend not having sex with that person, because if you actually have very different turn-ons and avoids and you're making compromises to be with each other, you're probably not going to have a very good time. And that just comes from personal experience. Oh my goodness, this goes even deeper. We're halfway through the book now, everybody. I see how long this video is getting. It's about body fluids, what we're okay with, where we're okay with it going. Are you okay with like ejaculation on your body? Or is that a turn on? Is it an avoid? Are you curious about it? We've also got on here menstruation and blood and trauma history. Now, when it comes to trauma, remember, you do not need to share your entire trauma history with people. It's personal. But knowing what happens to you when you are triggered and sharing that, I think is really valuable, because if you need to have personal space, if you need to stop what's happening, if whatever your thing is that you need, you want to make sure that you're able to actually have it in the moment, and the person's not going to take it on and think they're some kind of horrible monster, that they understand that you're having a personal moment and you need to do your thing. Next, when we combine our turn-ons and avoids, what kind of setting do we want and what comes into it? You'll see this long list on here, like if things are in the room, like I'm personally one where, like, for my lighting, if the lights are too bright, it's very distracting because there's so much visual information, and sometimes your eyes are closed or you're face down and it's dark, and then being in a really bright environment, I find very jarring and not very sexy. Maybe for you, the story is different. Also, questions on here around being vanilla or kinky, how you feel about anal and oral. These are great longer conversations to have with people. Maybe I've definitely taken a list like this and ticked off different boxes with a partner, and it let us have a point to start talking from, because when we talk about sex, I think a lot of us, like, we lose our voices. So a list like this is so great if you're having partnered sex, and especially if you want to introduce new elements in the bedroom. All right, that's it for avoids. We're on to relationship intentions. This is where I think people can also fall apart a little bit, because when you haven't been in a relationship, you tend to want to just kind of be open to all of the things. Really don't recommend that. It's good to know what you do want and where you're at today. Like, if you've mostly been straight your whole life and now you're curious about experimenting with bisexuality or pansexuality, pursue it. Go for it. Tell people that's what your orientation is. If you know that's not you, share that too. The things that you're attracted to are valid. And I also want to say on this, asexuality fits into these things, because there are pieces of intimacy that you may still really want. Pronouns and gender orientation. I find it's best to be with people who are familiar with what my orientation and pronouns are. I identify as pansexual, and my pronouns are she or they. If that is confusing to the other party, I know that they're probably going to say something that's going to hurt me, and I don't want to be with somebody who's going to hurt me in that way. Your relationship style. There's no wrong answer here, and your relationship style can change. If you're not familiar with what's on this list when it comes to non-monogamy, I highly recommend the Multiamory Podcast, or just put some messages under this video. Let's talk about it. Now that piece was really about intentions, but now let's talk about expectations, because this is one where I think people break down a bit, especially when it comes to casual sex, because there's always this idea of like, and I'm open to more. Now, if you're trying to have a casual play, have some casual play. If someone grows on you into a friends with benefits, that's great too. But you may also want to have some rules around what it would take to actually be in a relationship and what you actually want in a relationship. I like to break things down in terms of intimacy or nesting. Am I introducing you to my friends or family? And where are those lines for me? And what do I call this relationship to? You'll also notice relationship intentions is very much inclusive of more monogamy, more traditional ideas around relationships. Is it just sex? Are we waiting until marriage? Are you interested in having children? Because if you want to have kids and your partner doesn't, you're with the wrong person. Also, like financial interdependence and personal autonomy and sovereignty. Like, if we're in a relationship, does that mean I can't have sex with other people? Does that mean I have to limit my intimacy with other people? Is it okay to play at parties? Are we open to more in the future? And where are those boundaries for me before I'm in a relationship with you? Now that we've talked through relationship intentions, let's talk about safer sex etiquette. For safer sex, what do you need to actually feel safe? This is where becoming an expert on STIs is a really great thing to do, so you know what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. Please, 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 never use the word clean to describe a negative STI test. It's just bad practice. This is where a lot of what I talked about at the beginning come up again, because it's about what do you need to feel safe. Like for me, whenever I have sex with a new partner, I want to know that they've had a recent STI test. I would like to know if they've had partners since then. I want them to know and be okay with what I do and what my practices are. And I want to use condoms even if you've had a negative test. That's my rules. You want to know what's important for you. Don't forget that there are dental dams, there are condoms that go on penises, there are condoms that can go in a vagina or an anus. There's lots of different options. Planned Parenthood has some really good videos on this. Also, an important one on here around pregnancy. Are we trying to get pregnant, or how are we preventing pregnancy? That's a conversation I think most of us are familiar with when it comes to the safer sex talk, maybe the only piece we're familiar with. And then who's in charge of that? Because the answer is you both are. If you have a latex allergy, for example, that's something you also want to be upfront about. Also, when it comes to safer sex, it's about substances. I personally don't like to bring alcohol into the bedroom. There was a time in my life I was really cool with that and preferred it, and that part of my life is now over. When you're looking at this list for yourself, what does that mean for you? There's also questions around trust and vulnerability. Are these important pieces to you, or are they not important pieces to you? Now, she's also included neurodivergence in here. This, when we're talking about setting the room and the space for where sexy things may happen and talking about, say, lighting or music or distractions, this is where if you have ADHD, it might be really important to express those things in advance. I'm personally one where I'm like, I never want to put a movie on and get distracted by it with intimacy and play. I find that way too distracting for me. Maybe that's different for you. And she has also included a section that is about marginalized identities, because it's not always comfortable to talk about our culture or race, ethnicity, even sex acts that you're open to with other people. I have definitely run into the thing as a pansexual woman where I will be talking to a male partner and I feel very fetishized because they want to know everything I'm open to doing with a woman. And not cool. Everyone experiences this in different ways. That's how I experience it. I would love to hear, Mike, what kinds of things y'all go through in this, because it can be very cathartic. All right, that's it. We went through the whole workbook. Long video. I hope that you are following along and making your own version as we went, because this is really empowering to be able to invite in the relationships that we actually want and say no to the ones we don't. If you ever watch my show, my longer one, my podcast, I guess this is pretty long too, that's the whole point of that show. So this really fits into that model. I've also had Dr. Dacker on the show. You can watch that too. I also offer support groups for people who are polyamorous, into BDSM, or want to work with me one-on-one. So you can always go to giveandconsent.com if you'd like to see those. Until next time, my friends, love you more.